Hi, welcome everybody to this event. So many thanks to Haymarket for hosting us and everybody who's working on making it happen, including our interpreters and captioner. I am calling in from Chinook Ilahi, the sovereign lands of the peoples of the Chinookan Wawa or language group. And I'm really happy to be here with you all today. And I'm just going to give us a little bit of context for this tool that we are introducing in this event and that we've been kind of spreading around the last week or so, how we made it, why we made it, how it relates to what we're seeing right now. And then we can move into our discussion with this really amazing set of people who are gathered to talk about it. So the collaboration that created this tool emerged after the indictment of the 61 Atlanta forest defenders. You may recall that in late August 2023, a lot of people in our movements were reading this indictment, this kind of over 100-page document. Maybe somebody can put the link to that in the chat. If people haven't read it, it's actually worth looking at. It's this intense moment where the government is portraying the multifaceted, gorgeous work to stop Cop City as a criminal conspiracy. And to justify this sort of wide net of criminalization, the indictment paints a picture of a conspiracy of dangerous anarchists who want to destroy the government and use tools ranging from Molotov cocktails to sabotaging construction equipment to handing out flyers, camping in a forest, buying tarps, bailing people out of jail, helping each other out during hard times, putting things on the internet, holding gatherings, just this huge range of tactics are portrayed. And these are kind of just like the activities that we all might understand as the broad range of things that happen in the course of a widely popular campaign to stop the further expansion of police infrastructure and the further destruction of beloved wild spaces. And it's all kind of getting painted through this framework of criminal conspiracy in ways that are both like really chilling and terrifying, and at times almost humorous to see how our opponents understand us and misunderstand us. And I remember when I was reading that indictment for the first time, by myself, someone had texted me this link, and I was like, just feeling my brain jump all around. I think someone should mute. At moments, I was shocked at the crafting of the logic that could sweep so many people engaged in so many different tactics into one net, like, scary. And at moments, my lawyer brain was doing that thing like, you can't criminalize that. That's absurd. Kind of having that in-system thinking about how the indictment's charges don't make any sense inside the legal system that it's enforcing. And overall, I was feeling the just, fear at the escalation of repression that this indictment represents. And of course, it's a part of a much larger pattern, both the long-term pattern of criminalizing and repressing resistance that is coterminous with the colonial project of the United States, and the more recent patterns of escalation in the last decades and years that we could trace to various moments, like the massive buildup of policing in prisons in the wake of the rebellions of the 60s and 70s, the Green Scare, the crackdown on Occupy encampments, the criminalization of Black Lives Matter protesters in the wake of Mike Brown's murder, the crackdowns on anti-pipeline protesters, the increasing criminalization of protest in the wake of the 2020 uprisings, the current repression of people opposing Israeli genocide of Palestinians, and we could make so many more moments. We could go further back. I was really moved by an essay that William C. Anderson wrote last October that showed how the development of policing itself in the U.S. happens through the criminalization and scapegoating of anarchists. And I think Pilar is going to put that in the YouTube chat for me. In any case, we can see a pattern, a broad pattern that Peter Gelderloos names well in his forthcoming book, which is called They Will Beat the Memory Out of Us. He said this so simply. He said, if we find an effective tactic of resistance, they will turn it into a crime. And I think we see that like wearing masks is a crime, blocking roads is a crime, everything increasing all the time. So to go back to those reactions that I was having when I was reading the indictment, I was having both those internal lawyer brain reactions like, that's not even consistent with the law. And also my more radical discernment, seeing the bigger picture of domination, of which this moment of repression is part. And I felt that tension in me, those two kinds of thinking when I saw it playing out in the commentary that emerged after the indictment came out. And one of my biggest concerns was that I saw a lot of commentary on the indictment from people who I trust and learn from, other abolitionists, that actually made some of those more limited and I would argue like liberal, legalistic, inside the system logic arguments. And I was worried about how those arguments undermine solidarity and even endanger our people, especially those who use the boldest tactics. So I reached out to Pilar from Community Justice Exchange to talk about it. And I also reached out to Zora and Jocelyn because I was concerned about how I was seeing some of those themes in their commentaries. And I really, really, really admire them, learn from them as fellow abolitionist people thinking about law. And so we started this really generative conversation. And I wanted to name this because I think it's so important that we bring up these kinds of concerns with our fellow travelers, hear each other, give and receive feedback openly. And of course, it's scary to like say to somebody, hey, I don't like what you said, even though I really love you and what you do. And in this instance, it led to this immensely generative conversation about how hard it is to figure out when to use these different registers of critique, when to find that line, when to make which arguments, that sometimes we make certain kinds of arguments in front of courts or legislatures that are inside the logics of those legal systems because we're trying to get somebody out or we're trying to, stop something. And that, those arguments can have these anti-solidarity traps inside them. And that conversation led to this tool that we are launching this weekend with this event, hoping to help more people in our communities have conversations about how to not fall into some of those really easy talking points that I think we've all fallen into many times in our lives. And I'm sure I will again. We're not the first to observe these traps. These are dynamics that are like ongoing in our struggles, but we're just hoping this tool is another instance to generate conversations about how we can all talk about repression when it's happening and escalating like it is now in ways that don't throw each other under the bus. So I just want to quickly go through these five slides that were gorgeously designed for us by Billy D. And just for anyone who hasn't looked at the tool, and in the chat you can find a link to the whole tool, which has some more additional text framing these. But let's just look at the slides quickly so we kind of know what we're talking about, and then we'll dive into this conversation. So actually, John, will I be able to know when you are posting those slides and advancing them? Okay, great. I actually can't see them, so let me quickly. That's like I can't generate them from my mind yet. Let me see if I can find them. Oh, I know where I can find them. Okay. Apologies, everybody. If I remember correctly, the first slide is about trying not to legitimize our legal systems by the way we talk about a particular instance of repression. So trying not to say things as if this is such an unusual departure from the way the legal system usually works. Trying not to paint the legal system as usually fair and just, except for in this instance of repression. The second slide is about how sometimes our talking points pretend that universities are supposed to be and are usually neutral places for free expression of ideas. And the ways that erases the fact that our universities are colonial institutions, that they are funded and undergirded by weapons industries and the defense industry, that they are places where decisions are constantly made to shape conversations in ways that exclude certain frameworks and center others, and there's nothing sort of unusual about that in the moment of repression. And really just being careful to not kind of erase those histories and other realities of repression when we respond to a particular instance. The third image is about the tendency to talk about protest and resistance as if there are some good or nonviolent or peaceful protesters and others are bad or violent. And that is sometimes implied even when people just use the word peaceful protest, as if it wasn't peaceful, then it would deserve criminalization. So that's another kind of common talking point that I really, really especially love journalists to move away from. The next one is about whether the things we're saying, asking ourselves, are the things we're saying reinforcing tropes that cops and the system uses against our people. So the kind of boogeyman of the word anarchist or black extremist, or these kinds of words that get used again and again by right-wing media and government to justify criminalization, and because so many people, even in our movements, don't actually know some of those histories, people can accidentally pile on to that kind of targeted language. And the last one is, are we making an argument that makes it seem like there's just a procedural problem here? Like if the people had another hearing or had due process, then what's going on would be okay. Or if the cops had a warrant, it would be okay. Can we name the system's internal incoherence without suggesting that if it were internally coherent, it would be an acceptable response to our movements? So that's kind of, I hope people will look actually more deeply than I've just shared at the tool and at these images and the words we wrote with them. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Atara to moderate a conversation with all the folks here.
Thanks so much, Dean. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. This is Atara. I'm calling in from Massachusetts land, and I'm from the Community Justice Exchange. Thanks so much, Dean, for giving us an overview of the slides and the beautiful artwork. And we've assembled a panel of organizers and scholars whose work really informed when we put this resource together. So deeply appreciative of Jocelyn Simonson, Kamal Franklin, Dylan Rodriguez, and Dean for being here. I'm going to start with you, Dylan. Your analysis of counterinsurgency has been particularly productive and clarifying for many of us. How might the counterinsurgency frame help us understand some of the traps that we describe in the resource?
Peace. Thank you for inviting me to be part of the discussion. Let me just start by expressing my gratitude to Dean, to Zora Ahmed, to Jocelyn for co-authoring this guide, and to Kamal, as always, for providing constant, consistent examples of how to put the principles of this guide into action. So I just want to express my gratitude to y'all. Let me also begin by expressing my strongest, deepest, unqualified solidarity to Casey Goonan, a former student of mine, a dear friend of mine who was arrested yesterday on several felony counts under suspicion of property destruction at the UC Berkeley campus. I believe, many of us, we all believe that he will be liberated and released in due time. But more importantly, the repression that Casey is currently facing signifies a primary counterinsurgency strategy in response to your question. That strategy being to individualize, to personify widespread, growing global antagonism against the legitimacy of state power, US state power in particular, in this case, Israeli state power in addition, especially police and military power. So I and all of us can and must be with Casey Goonan at this time. So in response to your question, I think it's helpful to think through counterinsurgency's multiple dimensions. And I emphasize that in part because I think this is a concept that is way too easily reduced, pigeonholed, kind of stereotyped almost, to a small fraction, a tiny component of what I think about as a dynamic, dangerous ensemble of repression. It is multiple modes, it is multiple dimensions, it is multiple forms. And oftentimes counterinsurgency does not sound, look, or even read like repression. That is the insidiousness of it. In fact, anybody who even casually looks at the counterinsurgency curriculum of the US military will understand that a primary revision that the military made in the 21st century to its counterinsurgency curriculum is precisely that it is a state strategy as well as an extra state political logic. And it is a political logic that encourages liberal forms of resistance to state violence. including liberal forms of resistance to criminalization and policing. It also encourages collective empowerment, right? So what is so insidious about it is that counterinsurgency sometimes comes across as the opposite of repression. Counterinsurgency actually encourages collective empowerment that relies on state structures, on state processes like electoral politics, aka vote Democrat, government institutional bureaucracies, for example, city council and university task forces that make non-binding, easily ignored recommendations to the city and to the university about police defunding or about divestment from Israel's occupation and destruction of Palestine and Palestinian existence. So in that sense, I think the guide, the 5 Questions for Cultivating Solidarity guide, is an excellent mode of entry into a collective analysis of the multiple dimensions of counterinsurgency, especially how counterinsurgency expresses through both direct state power and beyond state power. So I'm especially grateful, I think, for how this guide produces an internal critical analysis of how lawyers, journalists, artists, scholars, teachers, organizers might actually reproduce the logic of state-directed counterinsurgency beyond the state, even as we declare support and solidarity for people targeted by state repression. So I'll finish my first comments here by just talking about the 2 symbiotic forms of counterinsurgency in terms of the framework that you're asking me to think through. This is what I've been thinking about alongside a lot of other people, including people who are here for at least the last 10 to 12 years or so. So the first dimension is in some ways the one that appears to be obvious. That is counterinsurgency as a form of statecraft. And here I think it is critical for people who are serious about understanding this concept to collectively read and collectively discuss the actual text of the U.S. Joint Forces Counterinsurgency Manual. Again, it was completely rewritten in the early 2000s, around 2006. It is a living military curriculum. By this, I mean that the manual is constantly undergoing revision to address changing global conditions of resistance and revolt against U.S. state and political economic power. So as a direct expression of state and military power, counterinsurgency has been framed by the joint forces as both a political, and this is what I want to emphasize, a political and cultural strategy, is a political and a cultural strategy to neutralize anti-state revolts and mobilizations, often anti-occupation revolts and mobilizations. I'm sorry, I'll slow down, y'all. Trying to get as much thinking in within some limited time. But part of the counterinsurgency strategy also embraces a kind of liberal attachment to social movements, as well as other forms of collective activity. So what counterinsurgency seeks to neutralize are all forms of collective activity that attack state power, but also attack the legitimacy of the state. And this includes activities that seem oftentimes that appear to be spontaneous or unplanned or decentered, that is, lacking an identifiable leadership structure. So I think it's worth being very explicit that counterinsurgency is particularly aimed, historically speaking, into the contemporary moment at repressing, co-opting, and otherwise pacifying or neutralizing left anti-colonial, Black liberationist, abolitionist forms of activity that undermine state power. I'll finish by just talking about the second dimension of counterinsurgency that is at least equally dangerous to this first dimension, and that is the way counterinsurgency has become a political logic that metastasizes beyond the state and beyond the military. So the guide, I think, addresses how the political logic of counterinsurgency is an under-recognized tendency within otherwise well-intentioned activist, journalistic, academic, legal efforts to defend people. What the guide actually helps expose is how resistance to overt state and institutional violence, like political prosecution, might actually reproduce the logic of that very same counterinsurgency activity. That's what I mean by the metastasizing political logic of counterinsurgency. So the guide provides a framework to rethink how we act in solidarity with the Stop Cop City 61, with Casey Goonan, with the hundreds of people facing punishment and repression for supporting Palestinian liberation, opposing ongoing Zionist Nakba. And to paraphrase the opening pages of the guide, the question is constantly, how do we avoid framings, terms, languages that legitimize the very same criminalizing systems, that is the counterinsurgency systems that we are trying to oppose and resist, if not delegitimize and overthrow. I'll pause there, and I'm looking forward to hearing everybody and learning from y'all.
Thank you so much, Dylan. You said a lot in such a short amount of time that I gave you, so I'm super appreciative. I'm going to move on now to Kamau and to you, Jocelyn. I have the same question for both of you, but we'll start with Kamau. As attorneys, both of you are attorneys and organizers. You weave in and out of different registers of being organizers, of being teachers, of being members of the community, and of being attorneys. How have you navigated these roles and these different registers? Kamau, you first.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. And my straightforward answer is that I stopped being an attorney. So that's one way in which I've navigated I've navigated myself out of that role. But I think, I think Dylan brought up some really interesting points around, the language I usually use, but I think Dylan's language is much more accurate, is talking about a propaganda war, a narrative war, a communications war. And I think we are trained as lawyers, but even as so-called social justice organizers, to think of things, and I use that term in particular because it's trained us to think of things through a very liberal perspective, that the state institutions and systems are inherently just, even if there are things at the fringes that need to be fixed. And so we are put into this system as professionals or as attorneys who are operating within these systems. And I mean, even as professionals, I mean that as sometimes organizers who are given the language through our training. And again, I think it's important that we talk about and I'll come back to this, the stage that we're in terms of nonprofit organizing, or how nonprofits influence the language that we use, even at those of us who feel we're at the most radical run of what organizing is. But in general, these systems are so overwhelming and powerful in terms of state constructed systems that we are sort of blocked into them. And so when I went to law school, the idea of justice sort of wrong to us over and over again as to how we are supposed to approach issues of fixing the system. We're going to be seeking justice through the very criminal or civil system, which has been at the root of the oppression for centuries. We will say things ultimately like, oh, there's something broken about the system. And then I think the corrective language is usually, it's not that the system is not broken. It was designed to work this way. But we feel like when the system is not working in the ways in which we want it to, again, the language that comes to us is a language of a broken system. And so again, I think these things are narrative fights, they're communication fights, they're propaganda fights, because within the bourgeois democracy, one of the first levels of control is the level of language. It is the level, again, of narrative. It is the level of propaganda that sweeps over the larger population in ways in which we describe issues, problems, and then what we discern to be the solutions to these issues and problems. Obviously, bourgeois democracy always holds within the potential for violence. For some communities, like Black and Brown communities, it is the use of violence that is used first, and propaganda is only a backup tool. But there's also other communities, vis-a-vis mostly white communities, that the issue of propaganda is far more important. But violence, as we've seen recently in terms of what's happened with the Stop Cop City protest at times, what's happened with some of the protests happening on various campuses, elite campuses, the use of the state's control over violence is never fall behind. It is something that they will wield in a so-called democratic society and then criminalize you for trying to defend human rights or trying to stop genocide. So a lot of times these narratives that the state puts out there are one first level of control. But when those controls, as I think is happening now, they are loosening. They're no longer as strong as they were 15, 20, 30 years ago. And some of this we have to talk about at some point, the advent of social media, talk about the ways in which people are now receiving information that is not akin or taken from bourgeois media, corporate media, mainstream media. people are now getting sources of information from other places that they no longer have to rely on either state sanctioned and or allowed institutions to tell us what is what. And I think, although of course there's, prior to social media, people got to the truth, but I think at this stage in history, people are seeing it and it is breaking through much faster, right? It's literally seconds away from happening when someone can upload 2,000 pound, the impact of 2,000 pound bombs being dropped on people's head, when people can see the murders of individuals who come from their community in real time. That sort of washes away the propaganda and then moves the state back towards the idea of violence. And so I think when we, coming back, and then I'll wrap up here, when we look at the idea of organizing injustice in terms of another realm, or organizing in terms of another realm in which we operate, we have to think back historically at what happened in the late 1960s and early 70s, when radical movements were overtly destroyed by the state. Those movements were attacked, movement leaders were murdered, imprisoned, turned against each other. What was left standing was the idea that we could vote our way into justice, and that we could organize through the ideas of a nonprofit industrial complex, which means that we got money from certain folks. We all, not all, I don't know if we all do, but some of us, including myself, have created these institutions and take some of this money. But we have this money that comes from certain avenues, which is geared towards pointing us to be appendages of the Democratic Party, to again think of solving our problems by getting a liberal Democrat into office, and then somehow that solves our problems. And so we, even when we use radical rhetoric, we are stuck in a mode of thinking that the system still has some legitimacy. And so therefore that is the avenue or the ways in which we should take that system. And so I think those things have a huge impact on why sometimes it is so difficult to get people to stand up for tactics which the state calls violence. And while people still overly use things like, oh, we're going to be engaged in nonviolent protest or nonviolent direct action, right? Because we've been trained into these systems. And it's only until we have more conversations like this, we challenge each other to be a little bit more radical, we have these tools that are being developed that makes us think deeply around the role of the government and the systems that have been created and their central role in keeping us oppressed vis-a-vis through the I would say through the direction of the capitalist class. But their role is to oppress. Their role is not to solve problems. It is not to bring justice. It is not to make us whole. It is not to figure out how to redistribute resources. It is to give us as little as possible in order to keep the current system alive and running. And the language that we use, whether we like it or not, sometimes plays into keeping that system or making that system more legitimate, as opposed to delegitimizing that system and the crimes that it conducts on all of us every day. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kamau. I had meant to include you, Dean, in this question, not Jocelyn. So same question, but to you, if you have for you to add your thoughts.
Thanks, Atara. And thank you, Kamau. I also want to say, when I've been trying to talk to people about this tool, some of Kamau's writing about the Atlanta indictment is some of the best examples I can find of someone showing the illegitimacy of the indictment while not saying that some of the, not saying something like, well, the people who handed out flyers shouldn't be indicted, but, with the underlying message that maybe some other people should be, or, Kamau's, if you're looking for a model for how to shape commentary, I do think Kamau's writing about the Stop Cuff City experiences of repression are what we're trying to suggest works really well. I just want to say about Atara's question, I think that, for me, early on in lawyering, I came to the understanding that as a lawyer, I often need to advocate for individuals inside a system, often by saying that they are special or exceptional, or that what happened to them is exceptional, when, of course, in reality, I know that the entire system is railroading everyone in it. So I might be like, this person is so wonderful and shouldn't be subject to these immigration consequences, or this person survived this terrible thing and so you should let them have this kind of, way out, or this person really deserves these welfare benefits, when of course I know the entire welfare system is designed to control and harm people, not to support the well-being of us all, right? There's all of these contradictions. And one of the things that's so challenging is to not let that thinking that lets me be a good advocate in that moment dominate my thinking about the system. And for the reasons Dylan and Kamau just said, in our system, if you talk inside that system, it sounds legitimate in general. So even people who aren't lawyers and who aren't talking to legislatures talk this way. Like, the thing was unconstitutional and we live in a democracy, and like all this stuff that's like as if the system usually works, but not in this one instance. And so that's like a big unlearning for all of us, because it's also when we're afraid, which we should be in these times of really scary stuff is happening to our communities, and there's nothing new about that, and there's a lot of escalation, we might feel like I've got to say the thing that sounds the most legit. And I think that's a lot of what happens. And it's really not like because anybody wants to throw others under the bus. I also think that when we're afraid and we don't know a lot about our movement histories, or about and we received so much propaganda our entire lives telling us that insider strategies are what will win, even though how could that possibly be true in a racist colonial system? We think that people who are using bolder tactics might be a threat to us. And that's like the fundamental thing we've got to be careful of, that can also generate this lack of solidarity that, I think is motivating us, creating this tool and motivating so many of these conversations happening in our movements about how can we stick together better in the face of all of this repression, even if we're not all using the same tactics as each other. And how can we not accidentally use language or frameworks that suggest somebody else does deserve the force of state repression and these people don't.
Thanks so much, Dean. Thanks, Dean and Kamau, for also naming that these are not traps that we engage with intentionally, that a lot of them come out of concern, fear, and protection. And Jocelyn, I wanted to ask you, as a person who writes about community protection, and as a legal scholar, what is challenging for you? Sort of end with what is most challenging about navigating these traps?
Great, thank you, and hi everybody. I'm so happy, honored, excited to be a part of this conversation and a part of putting together this resource. So I have not avoided these traps. I am not an organizer like Kamau. Instead, I am someone who teaches, writes, and lawyers in solidarity with organizers. So I'm coming to you from Brooklyn Law School, where I'm a law professor and on Lenape land. And I used to be a public defender before doing that. So everything I do is a part of legal domination and the carceral state, which is something that sort of I carry with me throughout the day. I, most especially, I think, I teach the law to hundreds of people every year who go on to become lawyers, many of whom become public defenders and prosecutors. And also as someone who works in a law school, I'm part of legitimizing the system day in and day out, no matter what I say. And so what I try to do is be a small part in this institutional role at a law school of helping various communities that I'm in think critically about the role that law is playing in domination, and also learn how to use the law as a tool for liberation in moments where it can be used. In my own writing, and especially my public writing, I specifically think about the rules of criminal procedure and how they can facilitate liberation, even as they are the master's tools and don't have a place in the world that we may want to see. So, for example, I'm in community with court watching groups that use collective observation as a form of building power, or with bail funds and bailouts, groups of people who use the rules of procedure around bail and bond to free people from cages in a way that challenges the system's claim to define justice, to define community, to define safety as something that we can get from a cage rather than from people taking care of each other. And so in many of these roles as lawyer, teacher, or scholar, trying to lift up this work and show the way that rules of criminal procedure and constitutional law interact with it, is constantly defined by oppositional categories that, as we've heard so eloquently described, uphold the legitimacy of the carceral state and other forms of state domination. So I teach people what the difference is between so-called legal and illegal things, criminal and not criminal things, the category of violent crime versus nonviolent crime, or things that are constitutional and not constitutional. And the challenge, and this is again, like all of these things, a problem that people have been talking about for centuries, if not more, is that it's hard to learn how to use a legal tool for liberation while not letting that lawyer brain take over the way that you talk or the way that you think. And it's not impossible, but it's a real challenge, and one that, as you heard, Dean called me into this conversation because I needed to be reminded of it too. And so that's part of why I'm so grateful for putting together this tool. But I think that's kind of a broad way of saying that everything about it is challenging. But what can be specifically, or a couple of challenges I want to name, is that for those of us who are either in or in solidarity with ongoing communal work to take care of each other, to be a part of movements for liberation, for a different world, when the repression and counterinsurgency around us changes, it can feel new, even if it's not new. And so something like the Cop City indictment, as we started out describing, really felt new to me, and I think felt new to a lot of people, and of course was bringing violence specifically on 61 people at the same time that it was doing this larger work that is both absurd and terrifying all at once. And so when something feels new like that, it's easy to come out as as a so-called expert or scholar and describe what's new about it, while forgetting to say out loud how it is a continual part of a history that can be traced backward of repression in response to powerful organizing. That's sort of just one thing that can be hard to do in the moment. And then I guess a second challenge I wanted to name, and we can come back and talk about others, is that the law does do liberatory work sometimes, not because it is justice, but because it's a tool. And so sometimes in the public, I want to support a First Amendment claim that a group is trying to make, or support the collective defense of a group that's being prosecuted. And it's a tricky dance, I think, to both support the legal tactics that groups are engaging in while not legitimizing the broader system that they're doing the work in. And so I think we've identified the questions to ask, and it doesn't necessarily have the answers, but I'm really grateful to have those questions.
Thanks so much, Jocelyn. Thanks for lifting up this constant challenge of supporting individuals and supporting movements, because movements are made up of people, and just sort of how this is an ongoing conversation, and there are no easy answers here. I wanted to switch gears and ask each of you to talk about the actual material harms that you have seen or that we see when we sort of lose a challenge or aren't as successful as we like to be. Because the reason that we wrote this tool was because we actually saw harm being done. And it wasn't an intellectual exercise, but it was having material impacts. What we were seeing was having material impacts on people's lives. So this question is for everyone, but I'm going to start with Dylan. What are the material harms when we succumb to these pernicious ways of talking about political repression? What's the real world impact?
So I'm going to start with the way that people who know me know I'm going to start, which is say, first of all, fuck that language. Fuck that language. The reason I start that way is number one, I feel liberated when I curse in particular instances, but also I'm doing it meaningfully in the sense that part of what this guide does is it helps us understand the damage and the internal disciplinary violence that is created by liberal language. And it's most, I think, perniciously attached to a version of what we might think about as liberal political respectability. The guide does a beautiful job of outlining what this means. It's the default resort to languages of nonviolence or even worse, pacifism. It's the default dependence on things like, the chattel anti-Black colonial U.S. Constitution as our baseline reference point for liberatory desires, right? Which is the opposite of what we should probably be doing, So when I talk about this as a disciplinary language, it not only tries to prevent incorrigible people like me and others from cussing the system out, which I think we should be doing all day, every day, collectively, right? But it also imposes active discipline on the collective political imagination. That is, to me, one of the, and this echoes what everyone else here said, in particular, Kamal, what you have devoted so much of your life work to demystifying, which is the active disciplining of the collective political imagination of possibility that to the contrary needs to actually be unleashed. It needs to be decoupled from any and all forms of liberal respectability, especially under conditions of duress. And when I'm talking about duress, I mean both intensified, acute periods of state colonial anti-Black violence and the long historical notion of duress, the forms of violence that are utterly normalized, but which are never quite normal. That there is a need to cultivate a political imagination that is wild and that is insurgent against these things. And the way that we keep coming back to liberal languages imposes liberal discipline. What I will also say is that this has a profoundly adverse effect. And I know a lot of people who are here and who are watching and listening and reading this will relate to this. These languages impose liberal political discipline on solidarity formations as if liberalism is the naturalized order of things. This happens in so many political formations and solidarity collectives I've been part of that I have actually lost count. And I've lost count in a really morbid sense in the frame that it is so constant. The naturalization of liberalism as the realistic approach, right? The responsible and respectable approach to a collective's political work, its framing of its objectives, even the way in which it's supposed to offer its disposition to the people and the administrators and the institutions that are in the positions of dominance, that are imposing the violence. That kind of liberal disciplining is just mind-numbing. And it is so kind of deeply normalizing and legitimizing of the very structures that we are alleging ourselves to be opposed to. So I'm thinking about liberal desire, right? Liberal objectives. In particular, and I'll stop with this point, the liberal desire to constantly claim shallow, superficial, symbolic, and by symbolic, I mean thinly symbolic, brittle symbolic victories, right? This attachment to victories. This attachment to victories that is, I think, in some ways deeply politically narcissistic. It is disrespectful to the long traditions of liberation struggle across peoples, across places, in which it's not about winning immediate victories. It's actually about liberation struggle, being attached in principle to continuing and sustaining and emboldening and expanding the liberation struggle. I'm saying that is the bare minimum. I'm not saying anything profound here. I'm just echoing back what the people who I have learned from and who I love and respect and who have passed in many cases have taught me and so many others, which is that is the collective imagination that gets stoked if we break up the attachment, the naturalized attachment to liberal frameworks and liberal ways of thinking. So that's my real world impact. And I think that that's a daily constant impact.
Thanks so much. Kamau, I'm going to pass it to you next.
Yeah, I mean, what Dylan said, it just rings so true. And to think of the real world examples, over 40,000 Palestinians murdered, and our inability to stop it because the liberal system, the neoliberal colonialists, the settler colonialists have created a system of how these things are allowed to be spoken about and what your actions can be done to stop them from taking place. And when you step outside, it's we're being suckered, right? We're the same people who use every act under the sun to retain power are telling us that in order to stop repression, oppression, and an actual genocide, that we must not only limit our actions, but we must be wary of the fact that if we engage in other actions which they don't condone, we will then be criminalized, as they are literally murdering people, literally paying for the murder of thousands of people. And so when we talk about the real world impact of this, it is right before us as we do this panel. It is our inability, because we live under a construct of propaganda and narrative wars that limits our ability to fight back in a meaningful or a more meaningful way than we already have. Let me put it like that. I think there's been a lot of meaningful actions, but we are constrained because in our own minds, if we go too far, then we ourselves are criminals, or we are doing acts or doing things that liberal society has told us that we should not be doing. And again, look back historically speaking, these things have divided movements and conquered movements because we've been allowed to play good activists, as referred to earlier, good activists versus bad activists, good organizer versus bad organizer. You can do things the right way, and they'll show us the examples of doing things the right way, which means that we get a permit, we show up at a certain time, we leave at a certain time, we conduct ourselves in a certain way, and then the state will hear us out, and they will duly note all the things that we've spoken about. They'll create a commission to study the issues at hand that we brought about, and then things will continue on as usual. Well, what's happening is that the system needs to be disrupted. More than that, but at the very least, it needs to be disrupted. And so allowing the system that is doing the oppression to set the terms of the discussion and the debate also allows them to section off and to destroy, as in kill, imprison, break up, cause feuds and fights amongst organizers, and choose who our leaders are. And again, this is very well documented, again, historically speaking, within COINTELPRO documents after the assassination of a Dr. King, who they were choosing to say who should be the next Dr. King. These are written in FBI documents. They were picking out Black leaders. After the assassination of Malcolm X, the idea that Malcolm X was a spearhead and or fountain of revolutionary Black thought, and so therefore was done away with. So the idea that there are people whose ideas and thoughts should be contained and, again, who can be criminalized is the way in which the system impacts us and impacts the direction of our struggle and continuously leads us back to believing, again, as Dylan was pointing out, that the highest way in which our rights, our values, our liberation can be achieved is by voting within the American context for liberal Democrats at best. So we have to see how this language completely takes us out of our ability to struggle, our ability to think of other forms of struggle, and our ability to kick aside the system and challenge it, as opposed to being under it and being controlled by it.
Thank you so much, Kamau. Jocelyn, you want to take this?
Sure. One thing that's so powerful about Dylan and Kamau's responses just now, I think, is that the question is about material harms, but the answer is, of course, demonstrating that ideological harms are material too. And so one of the things that I've found useful about the discussions in putting together these resources is remembering that to make an argument or a point that helps an individual can have ideological harm that hurts broader collective efforts to develop these radical political imagination that people are pushing for using all sorts of different tactics and ways. So one material harm might be that by using the terminology of the legal system, especially the kind that takes an individual and focuses on the state's version of what they did or didn't do, and lists the legal elements of the crime and asks whether it applies to them, that's the sort of question I'm asked to comment on all the time. To accept the premise of the question can be harmful in the broader context of what the work that the criminalization is doing to repress a broader movement. But on the other hand, to completely reject the question is to minimize the harm being done to the individual. And so to do the yes and to hold both out in front of us takes a lot of words, right? It takes an extra answer to a reporter, an extra paragraph, and something being written to connect both things at once. And so one of the useful concepts that I find is to circle back to the collective radical visions that are coming out of the organizing as something to point people toward, instead of pointing back toward the premise of the liberal question.
That's so helpful. Thanks so much, Jocelyn. And Dean, the last word on that question.
Yeah, when I think about the material harms of this, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is all the people who get caught up in the moments of insurgency and rebellion who, like, people don't have their backs. Like, we need more people to follow up with everybody who gets arrested and gets like a harsher charge or gets targeted because they did set a cop car on fire, or because they are accused of it, or because they were, like a lot of, and especially if they have immigration consequences or they already have a record that's going to make that harder. Like, we need our movements to not leave those people behind and ignore them. And so that is a very material thing, is like, we should be concerned about the people who are facing the worst consequences for taking risks for our freedom. And that worries me. When people are dividing good and bad protesters in their minds, it's really dangerous in terms of ditching each other. I think also it really contributes to other things that lots of people have named in our movements, like this term peace policing. When I'm at a protest and I'm trying to tell somebody else how not to resist, and I'm like, we should all follow the rules. Like, maybe I should take a pause and wonder if that person has a reason and a strategy and a tactic that they're pursuing with others to, towards transformation. And do I need to be certain that following the law or the rules is more effective? I think there's so many reasons to believe that if we follow all of the system's rules, we will not upend it. That feels pretty clear in the history of so many liberation movements. Another dilemma is snitching. When people are bought into the idea that we should all follow the rules and somehow that will liberate us from the system, they might be more willing to think bad things about those who broke rules that they didn't break and endanger them, so that's huge. Or they might take pictures of things that are happening and they shouldn't do that. Or, there's so many examples of this, not thinking, wow, my first order of business is the well-being and security of all the people who want to stop the genocide or want to stop Cop City or whatever we're out here about, instead of slicing and dicing who do I like best here and who's doing the same tactics as me. I think also when people label people as outsiders, if they did something more bold, that's a tactic that the right and the cops use against our movements. And it's something that sometimes people who are adhering to these liberal ideas do inside our movements. They say that the people who took the bolder action were outsiders, and it's not true. Or they otherwise paint those people like make up things about those people based on stereotypes or caricatures. I think this is a really huge thing. There's a deep misunderstanding of what anarchism is in our movements because of hundreds of years of repression, and the way that plays out day to day, often amongst people in our movements, is by thinking that like all anarchists are like white, when of course anti-state analysis starts with the most colonized and criminalized and targeted people, not white people. And so it's a huge erasure of anti-state tendencies and actions and histories and contemporary risk-taking by BIPOC activists. So that's dangerous, like that, sort of recycling caricatures in order to be part of stigmatizing certain tactics. And I'd say, just to echo what others have said, the most material dangerous problem with it is that it could make our movements ineffective. Because if we just follow all their rules about proper dissent, we will definitely not get something different than what they want us to get. Because of course, as I mentioned earlier, they will continue to expand the criminalization of anything we do that might work to stop the weapons shipments, the destruction of the planet, the imprisonment of our people. So yeah, we have to really, really shift that thinking if we want to be effective. And I think there's so much evidence that when people have used the boldest tactics, they've been the most effective in our movement histories. And we've been told a lot of lies. A lot of those lies hang on total misinformation about the civil rights movement in a way that's really heartbreaking in our school system and stuff, that tell us lies about what kind of risks those people were really taking, what kinds of multifaceted resistance they engaged in. And so yeah, there's just a real danger that we won't win much if we kind of stick to these liberal, very narrow ideas about what's an okay tactic, and if we then undermine each other when people take bigger risks.
Thanks so much, Dean. I mean, if it was proper, it's not dissent, right? So all of you have mentioned various sort of historical moments and the need, benefit, and how useful it is to actually look to the past to understand what is happening, that nothing is new, even if it is accelerated. So I'm going to close with the last question, just also being mindful of time. Jocelyn, I know that you have to go shortly, so I'm going to start with you. In all of your lives, which historical moments have shaped your political praxis and the way you think we ought to react, or you are currently reacting to repression, and how you practice solidarity? So I'll start with you, Jocelyn.
Great. Yeah. So I grew up in New York City in the 80s and 90s in a privileged world of the Upper West Side, as someone who is white and appears white. And I grew up taking buses and subways regularly, only sometimes using a bus pass, which is what we had then, rather than Metro cards. I jumped turnstiles, I went through gates, and I nearly every day got on the back of the bus without paying. And I did a lot of that in my privileged world without thinking about it too hard. But this was in the 90s where, as a teenager, as I started to go into other neighborhoods, I saw people getting arrested for getting on the back of the bus and for jumping turnstiles. And I saw it regularly, and I started to think about it. And as much as I grew up in a household where we listened to the news, and I could have told you about how I didn't like Rudy Giuliani or the NYPD because of the liberal politics that I was grown up with, that was probably my first set of moments, right? Which shows how privileged I was to notice that it was usually people who appeared to be male and of color who were getting arrested rather than me during a time of so-called broken windows policing, or the first version of it in the 1990s. And that's not a story about political action, but it's a story about my emerging consciousness of how criminality was not an actual thing, but rather something imposed by the state along lines of race and class, and just really obvious ways to me in that moment. And these are, so-called low-level crimes or misdemeanors that do real harm to people. If we fast forward, I was a public defender in the Bronx, not 10 years later, and representing thousands of people overall, and I'd say hundreds of people who were arrested under different administration. This was under a different mayor, a more liberal mayor who claimed to be doing better policing, and still it was Black and brown boys who were coming through charged with jumping a turnstile. And I say this because that to me was a story of political action and regular democratic politics not changing criminalization. And one of the most exciting, collective action that I saw at the time and that inspired me were people who were working on pushing back against the criminalization of taking subways and buses to get places by paying for other people to use MetroCards. So Swipe It Forward is one of the versions of the campaigns in New York City. People would go to subway stations, and especially in Black and brown neighborhoods, and swipe people through for free in ways that absolutely infuriated the NYPD and the system, because it messed with this constant criminalization of people just for trying to get from place to place. And at the same time led to forms of repression. So new rules about who you could share MetroCards with whom. And so that to me is kind of a story both of action of people helping other people resist criminalization and the system shifting its rules and its methods of criminalization in response. And I wanted to name that one because it's not a story about a large social movement. As much as groups that were part of collectives working to help other people. And all of the lessons that we're talking about today apply as much to small groups of people working together as to just the individual kid who's arrested for jumping a turnstile just for trying to get to school. And so remembering those connections between individuals and collectives and collective care for each other has been what's radicalized me and also, kept me going, given me hope.
Jocelyn, thanks so much. And I know we only have a few more minutes with you here. So just wanted to, from everyone, say thank you so much for being here. And thanks so much for writing this resource and putting your thought and effort into it. So super appreciative. And then Kamau, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. And she said bus passes. I was like, I remember bus passes, being from New York. So I'll tell two quick stories, which I think informed my praxis and my political beliefs and stances. One relates back to my mom, who grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, under Jim Crow. And she would tell us stories about what life was like in Jim Crow, including a story of her with several of her friends and their being in a whites-only playground. And being chased out by a cop, and she was slow, and she got hit in her back with a billy club by the cop, busted her back open, and she had a scar on her back until the day she passed, which was 2 years ago. Now, the act of being in a playground and being Black on a playground was a criminal, on a whites-only playground was a criminal act. It was something codified in law, that you were breaking a law by being a child and playing on a playground. That hearing that story had a huge impact on my thinking about what the law is, how the law is interpreted, who gets to use the law, and how the law works and in whose benefit it works for. And it's one of those things that got me down the line, reading all I could, sort of a ferocious appetite for the history of the civil rights movement, which led to the history of the Black Power movement, which led to in my estimation, a complete understanding of how the system of oppression and white supremacy works and who it works for, and who those laws are for and who they serve. And although I think it's correct that there are things within the law which may serve a sense of justice, but its overall impact is to keep the status quo the status quo. And the status quo will change when it makes sense for it to change, or when it supports a change, or when it can take a change and still keep its system going. The other thing, which it's a little bit surprising when I think back about it, is that when I did become a lawyer, and I was a young lawyer, and again, grew up in Brooklyn in the projects, seen a lot, experienced a lot. But the first time, even as a lawyer, I went behind the jails, and I interviewed one of my first clients. And I saw, this is in Brooklyn House of Detention, and I saw jail cell after jail cell after jail cell, and a certain reality that I already knew. It hit me in a certain way as a lawyer for some reason that it didn't hit me as again, a kid in Brooklyn from the projects or whatever, because it hit me in a way that told me that being a lawyer in and of itself was not going to solve the problem. It was not going to bring, quote unquote, justice to my entire community. And as radicalized as I was when I became a lawyer, I still thought that just by being a lawyer, and again, it's not like saying that being a lawyer doesn't serve certain purposes within larger movements. But I think even my own radicalism, he needed some more hits to its gut to be like you can do some good work doing this. But if you're really trying to challenge a system of oppression, it is organizing. It is organizing. It is organizing, which will lead you to the path of being in a position to challenge. It is not being a four corners attorney. And I do think attorneys have done great work in terms of, so as spoken earlier, in terms of supporting movement and winning victories for movements through the act of lawyering. And that lawyers provide a cover for organizers and activists to feel a certain sense of safety if something were to happen to them. But for me, a moment of praxis or developing even further ideologically was seeing what I sort of in my head was like, this is a slave ship. So it made me even more sort of redoubling my efforts to think about how I could dedicate my life to organizing and radical organizing, and eventually leave the law because it felt like I was becoming a cog in someone else's machine that told me that justice could be gotten this way, as opposed to fighting the system directly. And so those are some stories that helped me sort of develop praxis, not large historical moments again, as noted, but stories which had a large impact on me and my own history.
Thanks so much, Kamau. Dylan, your answer.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about historical moments. There's many, of course, but two jump out to mind today, anyways. One, and maybe this is obvious for some people here, the ascent of the fucking Obama campaign. Like the Obama campaign just fucked up so much stuff, and it really helped me understand a little bit better the obligation to develop a more serious analysis of the deep, damaging violence of the liberal U.S. dream of inclusive participation in global colonialism and the structures of anti-Blackness. Right. And the reason why this was such an important moment is I witnessed and felt firsthand how easily this particular kind of mobilization of what I will call liberal counterinsurgency solicited and seduced so many of the people that I love and care about and with whom I've done political and intellectual and other forms of work over many years. So that moment helped me understand how we need a better collective analysis of the liberal progressive front of counterinsurgency. Thank you again for this guide. This guide helps advance that project, I think. I think as importantly, what this did is it helped me embrace the obligation to identify the administrators, the professionals, the spokespeople of this liberal progressive front as enemies, right? To not give them slack, that these folks are enemies. I was really grateful during the post-2008 moment for all the people who unapologetically opposed Obamaism and rejected the bullshit dream of Obama's so-called hope. And I'm thinking here of the late, great Glenn Ford, the prophetic journalist, organizer, Black radical thinker who co-founded Black Agenda Report, who was right there. He was coming at the Obama administration and Barack Obama as a figure relentlessly and beautifully. And the reason why this is critical is because if we don't do this, then Obamaism and figures like this, they turn the people we care about and love and do political work with, they turn those people into folks who are close to us, but who nonetheless act like enemies of liberation and liberationist principles. The second moment I'll point at, which I have to identify this moment because it still moves me to this day, was when the relatively recently released U.S. political prisoner and well-known contributor to the Black Panther Party, the late Geronimo Gijaga. Geronimo Gijaga walked into an auditorium on the campus of UC Berkeley and surprised a couple thousand people during the first meeting of the Critical Resistance Conference in 1998 on the campus of UC Berkeley. He walked out and he addressed the crowd, and we were just, it was just really just a thrilling moment because most people didn't know he was coming. But Geronimo Gijaga helped exemplify how solidarity lives. And in particular, what stood out was how he did not frame his own experiences and survival of repression, of political incarceration. He didn't frame that as a sacrifice. He didn't talk about it that way at all. He talked about everything he had lived and experienced as an honor, as a contribution. So he and so many other, especially surviving U.S. political prisoners, Jalil Muttaqim, who's doing his thing still, Mumia Abu-Jamal, still doing his thing, the late Rita Bowe Brown, the late Safia Bukhari, the late Rochelle McGee, the late Sekou Odinga, the late Mutulu Shakur, all these surviving political prisoners of U.S. war, they exemplify a praxis of resistance to repression and a commitment to the militant experiments of building solidarity that directly expose and destroy the legitimacy of a state and racial capitalist order. And I will just end by saying this. These are folks who encourage us to actively stoke the destruction that is the abolition of that form of all those forms of oppressive violence. So yes to the notion of abolition as creative, yes to the notion of abolition as making things. Absolutely, Ruthie Gilmore, I honor you and I honor that contribution. And Miriam Kaba, I honor you, I honor that contribution. I would just humbly add, in echoing back what others have also taught us, abolition is also a necessarily destructive praxis. And that those two things, the creative and the destructive, they must not be artificially separated from each other in the service of pandering to liberal sensibilities.
Dean, I wanted to give you the opportunity to speak, and also would be very glad to move on to questions from the audience with Dylan's words in our mind, but wanted to give you the opportunity as well.
I do really want to share some examples.
Yeah, go. Yeah, please.
I just wanted to say, like, for me, when pivotal political moments of my life are when I've heard of examples of people not taking the route of saying the thing that makes it like palatable and liberal, and so one of the first lessons I ever got of this, I think in the late 90s or early 2000s, the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, which is like a really ragtag group of people, like a lot of unhoused people, a lot of people on public benefits. They're facing a situation where in Ontario, there was like a special exception where you could get a little more like food stamps, basically, if you said you needed a special diet for a medical need. So social workers were onto this, and other like organizers in the community. So lots of people were saying they had this special need to get enough food stamps, right? Because you can't really live on the amount they give you. And then it got exposed as like a fraud. And the OCAP, instead of launching a campaign showing all the people who had special medical needs, launched a campaign that said, you can't survive on these benefits unless you defraud them. We're all frauds. And those kind of moments, to me, like that kind of reframe, that refusal of a respectability politics. And another example of this that I just want to surface, especially for people interested in lawyer stuff, is the book Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, which outlines in the 1970s, when people in Detroit, there's a lot of amazing Black auto worker organizing. It's very militant. There's incredible organizing against the police. The police are like outrageously, intensely targeting Black communities. And there's these kind of amazing moments that come to pass where, because there's such a baseline shared radicalism in the community of anti-police sentiment and anti-racist sentiment, really wild things happen where lawyers like put the system on trial when somebody from the community is on trial. And it's like this rare reversal that's not something a lawyer can just decide to do. It's something that actually requires there being like a critical mass of organizing that makes that possible. And that book shows that in a way that I thought was like like a little glimmer of what it could look like as our movements get a lot bigger and we're less trapped by these talking points, even inside our encounters with the system. And then two other examples that just like really make this plain for me about kind of what gets the goods, you know. I think a lot about those fights around trying to get Confederate statutes taken down and how like you could never win those legally. And then when people just physically take them down, they don't get replaced. You know, and that is so like that's so indicative, right? Even though statues are symbolic in some ways, just like what mattered was the material action. And the other example that just popped into my mind is the story of these two people who sunk the entire Icelandic whaling fleet and destroyed the whaling processing center in Iceland. Rod Coronado was one of the activists involved in this, and he talks about it in some places, and you can find the story. But like they wanted to stop whaling, so they stopped the whaling by ending the facilities that made it possible. And as I understand, it wasn't replaced. But trying to win that through the system had not worked for people who'd been trying it for a long time. So I just think it's like these stories are hidden from us. There's so many people who have such amazing accounts of them. There's so many, you know, endless other stories of direct action getting the goods. But for me, that really learning them changes my mind about how I want to be in solidarity with everyone trying bold tactics. And it is heartening. Like, it's just like, oh yeah, sometimes people stop stuff. I mean, all the tree sits, all the pipeline blockades, all the, you know, so many things people are doing to just stop the machines of destruction that are endangering all life. So that I think all of the, I think studying social movement history is like essential to keeping centered and feeling inspiration while doing this work under these conditions, and then especially trying to find those stories that have been hidden from us about how people you know, show our power.
Thanks so much, Dean. I'm just also want to be mindful of time, so I'm going to wrap up a little bit, and sort of, Dean, what all of you said, and then what your voice just in my head is, we cannot hear these stories if we are not in solidarity with each other. One of the things that criminalization, repression, counterinsurgency does is isolate us from one another. And solidarity is about being a community, being in cooperation, listening, not throwing each other under the bus, not telling on each other when we say fuck or shit or asshole, or do other things that maybe we wouldn't do. But that's how we get to hear each other's stories. And to sort of, this resource is an invitation. It's not a dictate. It's not a punishment. It's an invitation to be in community with each other, or to be more deeply in community with each other, and really think about how we're framing people within movements, so that we can all work towards both the building and the destruction together. So I want to thank all of you so much for being here. Kamau, Dylan, Jocelyn, thank you so much to our interpreters, to Haymarket, and most especially, I really want to thank you, Dean. It was your generosity of spirit and openness and invitation that brought us all to the table to actually be in community with each other, and to learn from one another, and to not be defensive, but open. So really, really grateful to you. Thank you so much for creating this space for us. And to everyone who was able to come, or everyone who is listening, we'll put the links to the resource in the chat. And again, this is an invitation for you to take these, make them useful for you, make them useful for your community, and have a good night. Thank you all so much.